Several years ago, I went with my girlfriend, Trish, my buddy, John, and his girlfriend, Katie, to the Colorado Rockies during the middle of winter. John has been a close friend of mine for years, and we enjoy outdoor activities together, such as hiking, snowboarding, and mountaineering. His family owns a cabin in the area, so we decided to stay there for a couple of nights. We picked a weekend when snow was in the forecast. By the time we got to the cabin, there was already snow covering the ground, with more predicted for the following day. On our first evening there, we all relaxed by soaking in the hot tub and sipping wine. The cabin is very isolated, deep in the forest. That night, as we sat in the hot tub, small snowflakes were gently falling, hinting at what was expected the next day. The following morning, we woke up to see a light snowfall outside. It wasn't as heavy as the forecast had suggested, and only a small amount of snow had accumulated on the ground. However, we remained optimistic that it would continue throughout the day. John decided to fuel up the quad stored in the large shed behind the cabin. We had to jumpstart it using my truck, but once it was running, we all took turns riding it around the property. John's family owns a sprawling piece of land, perfect for quad adventures. There were wide-open areas great for drifting and doing donuts, along with narrow, winding trails through the woods. The snowfall picked up a bit as we spent hours taking turns on the quad. John rode with Katie while Trish and I grabbed sleds and slid down a large hill on the property. After some time, we all went out for lunch. I had brought my pickup truck, so getting around in the snow wasn't an issue. When we got back, the girls decided to take a nap while John and I decided against it. Instead, we geared up for a hike into the woods, climbing one of the trails we had explored on the quad earlier. This trail led far beyond the property and climbed up the mountainside. Both John and I are in great shape, so the uphill trek through the snow didn't bother us much, though it could have been exhausting for someone not used to it. We hiked for about 30 to 60 minutes, reaching a spot near the summit. It would have offered a breathtaking view if not for the fog and heavy snowfall. All we could see was a blanket of white. We stopped to rest and sit in the snow. By now, the snowfall had intensified significantly. I asked John again, just to be sure, "Are you positive you know the way back?" He confidently assured me that he did. We began our descent as the snowstorm turned into a full-fledged blizzard. As we moved downhill, I suddenly heard a strange moaning or humming noise coming from behind us. I told John to stop and asked if he heard it. He said no. We stood silently, listening. Then, the sound came again, a low rumbling, almost human-like noise from not far behind us. We picked up our pace, both of us unnerved. I asked, "What do you think it is?" And John admitted he had no clue. A short while later, I thought I heard the crunching of footsteps behind us. I told John to stop again. This time, we both stood still and listened carefully. The snowfall had created an eerie silence, which made the sound of footsteps unmistakable. It was too foggy, and the forest was too dense to see who or what it might be. John whispered that it definitely wasn't an animal, as no wildlife would be following us while we were making noise. At that moment, I felt my phone vibrating in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw that Trish had been blowing up my phone with texts. Since I didn't have service earlier, all her messages came through at once. As we continued walking, I took off my gloves to read the text. She was asking if John and I were outside the cabin and said they were too scared to check. I tried to respond, but my messages didn't send due to losing reception again. I explained the situation to John, and we decided to hurry back. All the while, the strange humming and moaning noises continued behind us. At this point, we were practically running down the mountain. Eventually, we saw the lights of the cabin through the darkening woods. When we reached it, we knocked on the door and the girls let us in. Trish and Katie were visibly shaken and began talking over each other, explaining what had happened. They told us they had seen two people walking outside the cabin about 10 minutes earlier. One of them even stopped to peer through the window. Too terrified to shut the blinds, they had hidden in one of the rooms until we got back. John immediately went to his dad's room and grabbed a gun. With the blinds now closed, we debated what to do next. Eventually, we decided to go out for dinner as planned, but John and I stepped outside first to check the area. He brought the gun with him. After a quick scan of the property, we told the girls it was safe to come to the car. On the way to the diner, John and I decided not to tell the girls about the strange noises we'd heard in the woods, as it would only make them more frightened. We returned to the cabin shortly after dinner and decided to stay inside for the rest of the night. Later that evening, while watching a movie, we heard a loud and aggressive knock on the door. We all froze, exchanging fearful glances. John grabbed the gun and stood by the door. The knock came again, just as forceful. John asked if he should yell a warning, but I told him to stay quiet. After that, there was no third knock. The girls went to bed, but John and I stayed up in the living room, sitting in silence with the gun loaded nearby. We eventually decided to sleep there, just in case. The next morning, we packed up to leave. As John and I were tidying up and putting things back in the shed, we noticed something strange. There were no footprints in the snow outside. It was possible the fresh snow had covered them, but it still didn't sit right with us. Whatever happened that night remains a mystery, but we were certain it wasn't anything good. This happened when I was home alone as a kid. I was in 7th grade, and my parents had just started leaving me on my own. Whenever they were out, I'd usually just spend the time playing video games. The gaming setup was in the basement because my dad didn't want my older brother and me playing in the living room. The basement in my parents' house is pretty big, but it used to terrify my brother and me when we were younger. Back then, we'd switch off the lights and sprint up the stairs as if something sinister was chasing us. By the time I was 12, I wasn't as scared anymore, but I'd still glance over my shoulder occasionally when I was alone down there, especially if the house was empty. That night, my parents were out doing their thing, and I was in the basement playing whatever video game was my favorite at the time. Suddenly, there was a loud bang against one of the basement windows. The noise startled me so badly I nearly jumped out of my chair. I quickly turned around to look at the window. It sounded like someone had slammed their fist against the glass. It was dark outside since it was cloudy and snowing, but I could see some snow particles stuck to the window. I figured an icicle must have fallen and hit the glass. Trying to shake it off, I returned to my game. But before long, there was another loud thud against the same window. This time, I stood up and moved closer to inspect it. More snow was sticking to the glass now, and it became clear that someone was throwing snowballs at the window. My first thought was that it had to be my brother Keith. I went upstairs and opened the backyard door to check. Peering through the glass exterior door, I could see the brick wall to the left blocking most of the yard. I stepped outside, wearing just a pair of slides, and felt the icy wind and snow hit my face. Walking past the brick wall, I called out Keith's name, asking why he hadn't told me he was coming home. I then spotted someone hiding in the bushes near the back fence. I shouted, "Keith, I see you." But the longer I stared, the more I doubted it was actually him. Fear creeping in, I went back inside and locked the door. I grabbed the phone and called my mom, asking if Keith was supposed to be home. She told me no, that he was staying over at a friend's house. Just then, another snowball hit the window. I asked my mom if she'd heard it over the phone, and she said she had. I explained that someone was in the backyard throwing snowballs at the windows. She quickly put my dad on the line, and he asked if it could just be some kids messing around. I wasn't sure. I was too freaked out to think straight. My mom told me to stay upstairs in my room with the door locked while she called the police. I hurried up to my bedroom and kept the lights off. Though it was getting darker outside, I could still see someone walking around in the backyard. They were peering into the downstairs windows and even knocked on the kitchen window, where they had been throwing snowballs earlier. It was clear they thought I was still downstairs because the light had been left on. They weren't a kid either. They looked too tall for that. They had on a jacket or coat with the hood pulled up, so I couldn't tell much else. Then I saw them trying to lift one of the downstairs windows. Thankfully, the windows had been locked for months because it was winter, but it was obvious they were attempting to break in. The moment they started looking up toward the upstairs windows, I ducked down. I didn't dare peek out again, but moments later, there was a loud bang against my bedroom window. They must have seen me. More snowballs hit my window, but after that, it suddenly went quiet. My mom called back to check on me and let me know the police were on their way. It felt like an eternity before the doorbell rang. When I checked to make sure it was the police, I saw a lone officer, a woman who looked to be in her 40s. She came in and then walked around the property with her flashlight while I stayed inside, watching through the windows. She inspected the bushes, the patio, and even the shed. When she came back, she told me there were footprints all over the yard, but whoever had been there was gone by then. She spoke with my mom on the phone for a bit and then reassured me she'd stay until my parents got home. When they arrived, the officer left, and everything went back to normal. Looking back, I still wonder if it was just some weirdo trying to scare me or if they had more sinister intentions. The way they tried to open the window makes me think it could have been an attempted break-in, but throwing snowballs first seems like a really dumb way to go about it. I can't shake the feeling that they were just trying to frighten me for their own twisted amusement. Winter storms in Alaska aren't unusual. Most of us here know how to handle a snowstorm, even the fierce ones. I've been living alone in this house for about 5 years. It's a modest place on the edge of the woods, far enough from the city to feel quiet but close enough to make the commute manageable. That night, though, the storm hit harder than usual. It was a Friday in late December 2017, and I'd closed up the store early, sending my staff home before the roads got too bad. By the time I got back, the snow was falling thick, turning my driveway into a white, uneven mess. After shoveling just enough to park, I went inside, locked up, and turned on the heater. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows now and then, but I found the sound comforting. I made myself a mug of cocoa and settled into my worn recliner, the kind that leans too far back if you're not careful. It was shaping up to be the kind of evening I liked. No noise, no people, just me and the storm. Around midnight, I was halfway through a random documentary on glaciers when I heard a knock. I hit pause, sitting up straighter. I live pretty far out, and my nearest neighbor is at least a quarter-mile down the road. Visitors at midnight? Not exactly common. I got up, pulling the curtain aside to peek out the front window. Snow was falling heavily, blurring the porch light. No one was there, just the wind swirling flurries across the yard. Then I saw boot prints. They led right up to my door and back down the step. They were fresh too, sharp edges, no snow filling them in yet. Opening the door wasn't an option. The wind would have blasted snow straight into my entryway. Besides, something about those prints unsettled me. I stood there for a moment, my hand hovering over the deadbolt, listening. Nothing but the wind. After a minute, I locked the door again and went back to my recliner, trying to brush it off. Maybe someone got lost. Maybe it was just a random hiker. But deep down, it didn't sit right. About an hour later, the second knock came. This time, it wasn't at the front door. It came from the side of the house, near the kitchen window. I got up quickly, my pulse picking up, and grabbed the flashlight I kept by the door. The kitchen window was completely frosted over, so I couldn't see much. I flicked off the lights inside and aimed the flashlight outside. Nothing. The snow outside that window was untouched. No footprints, no signs of movement. But the knock had been real. I was sure of it. I stayed there for a while, flashlight in hand, scanning the yard. A few minutes passed, and I convinced myself it was a tree branch or maybe even the storm playing tricks. I turned the lights back on, locked all the windows, and went to bed, leaving the flashlight on the nightstand. I woke up to the third knock. This one was louder. It came from the back of the house, near the sliding glass door that led to the deck. My heart sank as I sat up, straining to hear over the wind. Sliding out of bed, I grabbed the flashlight and crept down the hallway. The sliding door was locked. I'd checked it earlier, but the curtain wasn't drawn. I paused a few feet away and peered out. The deck was empty. The snow-covered deck beyond the glass was undisturbed. No tracks, no signs of anyone standing there. But the knocks had been real, 3 sharp raps, as clear as day. I stayed there for a while, staring out into the swirling snow. The only thing visible was the faint outline of the woods beyond the yard. The rest of the night was worse. The knocks didn't stop. They came every hour, sometimes louder, sometimes softer, front door, side windows, back door. They moved around the house like someone was circling it. At one point, I thought I heard faint footsteps crunching through the snow, but when I looked out, there was nothing there. The storm was too strong to go outside, and even if I could, what was I supposed to do? Chase after invisible knocks in a blizzard? I spent the rest of the night on edge, flashlight in hand, every light in the house on. By morning, the storm had eased. The wind had died down, and pale sunlight filtered through the overcast sky. I stepped outside cautiously, bundled in my thick coat and boot. The yard was quiet. The snow was deep but undisturbed in some areas. But as I walked around the house, I started to notice footprints. They weren't just at the front door or the deck. They were everywhere. Bootprints circled the house, weaving between the windows and doors. Whoever had made them had walked the perimeter several times, stopping at every entrance and every pane of glass. When I reached the edge of the woods, what stood out most was that the footprints continued deep into the forest, weaving between trees. So I decided to follow them. About 200 yards in, the footprints changed. I stopped dead in my tracks when I saw them merge with something else. Tire tracks. The faint imprint of a snowmobile had flattened the snow, the path curving off into the distance. I crouched down to look closer. The tracks weren't fresh. There was a thin layer of snow covering them, likely from the storm that had continued into the early hours of the morning. Whoever it was had planned this. They'd left just before daylight, knowing the snowfall would cover their escape. I stood there for a while, staring at the path, debating whether to go further. But the snowmobile's trail was faint, barely visible anymore, and I wasn't exactly equipped to trek through the woods for miles. Back at the house, I called the police. 2 officers arrived about an hour later, a younger guy and an older one who looked like he was no stranger to the unforgiving cold of Alaskan winters. They listened as I explained what had happened, their expressions shifting from skeptical to serious when I mentioned the snowmobile tracks. The younger officer raised an eyebrow. Could be kids messing around. The older officer shook his head. Not a lot of kids riding through blizzards at night, he said, giving the younger guy a look. They followed the tracks into the woods but returned within 15 minutes. The snow had almost completely filled them in by then. Too faint to follow, the older officer said. But this wasn't random, he added. Whoever it was knew exactly what they were doing. A lump formed in my throat as I asked, "What do you think they wanted?" Hard to say. Could have been someone looking for shelter, or maybe they just wanted to scare you. That word didn't even begin to cover it. After the officers left, unease settled over me like the heavy snow outside. I couldn't stop picturing the footprints circling my house and the snowmobile waiting like a getaway vehicle. This wasn't some harmless prank. Whoever it was had planned this, stalking around my home during the storm, knowing I wouldn't venture outside. By mid-afternoon, I knew I wouldn't make it through another night without doing something more. So I grabbed my jacket and headed into town. The nearest gun store was about 20 miles away. The drive felt surreal, like I was stepping into someone else's life. I'd never been one for firearms, but after last night, the thought of being unarmed if someone came back wasn't something I could live with. I left the store with a 9mm handgun, a hunting rifle, and enough ammunition to feel like I had a fighting chance if things ever escalated. The clerk even threw in a quick lesson on proper handling and storage, though his parting words stuck with me more than anything else. Don't go looking for trouble, but make sure you're ready if it finds you. I own 3 properties, 2 of which I rent out through Airbnb. The third is my personal residence in Montreal. The events of this story took place at my rental property in Wakefield, Quebec. It's a cozy, secluded home in the woods, as advertised. The house has 2 bedrooms, but due to its small size, it's more suited for couples. Occasionally, groups of 4 or more will book it. These groups are the ones I usually keep an eye on because they're more likely to cause damage. Couples, on the other hand, tend to leave the place relatively tidy, and I rely on my cleaning lady to handle things after they check out. When larger groups stay, I usually make the trip myself to clean and inspect the property for any damage or missing items. The house is only about a 2-hour drive from Montreal, and when I go, I often spend the night there. This particular trip followed a weekend stay by a larger group, so I wanted to personally ensure everything was in order. Before heading out, I notified my nearest neighbor, as I always do. He rarely visits his property, just like me, so I usually let him know when I'm in the area and ask if there's anything he needs me to check on, like his mail or any packages. He replied quickly, letting me know he wouldn't be up there this week and asking if I could look for any mail from a specific sender. On my way to his place, I pulled into his driveway to check his mailbox. As I walked over, I noticed footprints in the snow alongside his house. Before investigating, I opened the mailbox and found only a few junk mail envelopes, credit card offers, and similar items. I let him know there wasn't any mail from the person he mentioned. I also told him about the footprints on his property. These weren't from the mail carrier since they came out of the woods, approached one of the windows, and then continued around the back of the house. He called me and asked me to follow the tracks to see where they led. I did, tracing the footprints as they went around the house and eventually disappeared into the woods on the opposite side. He didn't seem overly concerned, saying, "As long as they didn't break in, I don't care." With that, I left and drove the remaining minute up the hill to my own property. When I arrived, I noticed footprints in the snow around the house. This caught my attention because the previous guests had left a couple of days earlier, and there had been snowfall since then. It was odd that their footprints hadn't been covered by the fresh snow. More snow was forecast for later that night, so the tracks would likely disappear by the following day. The first thing I did was reset the security lock on the front door for the next guest. When I stepped inside, the place was a mess. The sink was piled with dishes and glasses, the trash bin was full, and empty soda and beer cans were scattered everywhere. Some guests think that because they're paying a cleaning fee, they don't need to tidy up. I went through the house thoroughly to confirm nothing was missing or damaged, then started cleaning. I had music playing while I worked, but I soon heard something over the music, sounds coming from outside. The house is situated on a hill surrounded by forest, so no one should be nearby. I turned off the music, and clearly heard footsteps in the snow just outside. They passed by one of the windows and continued toward the backyard. I quickly locked the front door and remained quiet. Whoever was outside had to know I was there since my car was parked out front. For the next 20 minutes, I sat silently in the living room, listening. When no further sounds came, I decided to go outside to check. Walking around the house, I found fresh footprints circling the property. They seemed to stop or overlap in the backyard near the window air conditioning unit. I glanced toward the woods, feeling certain someone was out there watching me. Uneasy, I went back inside and stayed there for the rest of the day. I ordered food, which took forever to arrive, and had it as a late lunch and dinner. After finishing the cleaning and laundry, I spent the evening working remotely on my laptop. By now, it was snowing again, and the forecast predicted it would continue all night. Snowy nights tend to bring in more guests, as they love the cozy vibe of the house. Around 8 p.m., I took a break from work to watch a movie. During the film, I started hearing creaking noises coming from the ceiling, sounds I'd never noticed before. Since there's no attic, I guessed it might be the weight of the fresh snow causing the roof to shift. After the movie, I went to bed. The sound of snowflakes hitting the window sill was calming, but the peace was shattered by the unmistakable noise of footsteps outside. The realization that someone was out there in the middle of the night was terrifying. The footsteps passed by my window and faded into the distance. I sat on the edge of my bed for what felt like 20 minutes, bracing myself for any further sounds, like a door being tampered with, that would push me into full alert. When everything remained quiet, I grabbed my coat, shoes, and a baseball bat and went outside. Sure enough, there was another fresh trail of footprints. This time, they started at the air conditioning unit and led into the woods. It dawned on me that someone had likely climbed onto the roof using the AC unit. I went back inside and decided it was time to call the police. A Wakefield officer arrived about 20 minutes later. He checked around the property with me and even climbed onto the roof, confirming that there were indeed footprints up there. He reassured me that he'd patrol the area and not be far if anything else happened. Before leaving, I mentioned the similar footprints at my neighbor's house, just in case this person, or people, was targeting multiple properties. The officer thanked me for the heads up and promised to keep an eye on the area. I left the next morning and later rented the house out to another group of guests. Thankfully, they didn't report anything unusual during their stay. This was an isolated incident that happened over a year ago, and thankfully, nothing like it has occurred since. If these snowstorm nightmares sent chills down your spine, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more bone-chilling tales. What would you have done differently in these icy encounters? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear them. Know someone who thinks snowstorms are all cozy nights and sledding fun? Share this video with them. They might need a reminder to trust their instincts. Stay warm, stay safe, and always keep an eye on those frosty shadows. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.